is communication, to your point, is so much more than just presentations you give at work or getting the next sale or getting the next raise. It's every micro interaction of our lives. It's the way that we order ice cream at an ice cream parlor. It's the way that we order food at a restaurant. It's the way that we talk to strangers at a park. It's the way that we interact with our families, right?
Welcome to the Every Breath Counts podcast. I'm Ryan Sheckle, health enthusiast, amateur ultra runner, and award-winning business consultant. And each week, I interview the most accomplished people in the world, from professional and Olympic athletes to CEOs, best-selling authors, and even the occasional magician, to demystify what it takes to achieve success at the highest level. Take what you can from these stories to optimize your mind, your body, and your career so you can make every breath count. Thank you for investing the time in the show and yourself. Now let's get started. So I want to start by sharing the old Seinfeld joke that I think people might know, they might not know, but it's great. It's that the biggest fear in the world is public speaking, which means most people would prefer to be in the casket than give the eulogy at a funeral, it's hilarious to me, but it's funny because people hate speaking. So why is that? Why do people hate speaking, and how can we get over that fear, man?
You know, it's funny. I've heard of this Seinfeld quote as well, Ryan. And what's hilarious is I've never watched a single episode of Seinfeld, but I know that specific quote.
Oh my God. Am I that old, or are you that young, or what is that?
No, I'm just misinformed because I'm so bad at culture, so it's not your fault. Okay. It's totally mine, actually. And in the context of your question, I've thought about this question a lot, too. Because I always felt, and I feel society in general, thinks that public speaking and the fear of it is somehow innate in all of us. Like we're all supposed to be scared. But then I thought a bit more deeply, Ryan, and I realized that it's perfectly normal as to why we're all scared of communication. And I'll tell you why. The first question is, where do we give most of our presentations? That's probably where the answer is. Where do we start that habit? And the answer is school. Right? Because in school, even if whether people went to university or college or not, we go to elementary school, we go to high school, and in those environments, this is where we learn the habit of communication, how to give presentations. But here's the punchline, Ryan. There's 3 specific problems with all of those presentations that no one has really pointed out, so hopefully I'm the first one. And if not, even better. So the first one is all of those presentations are mandatory. We don't wake up one morning and say, hey, Ryan, you want to get breakfast and present all day? It says nobody ever, especially when you're 11 years old. So that doesn't make any sense. Number 2, all of those presentations are different. So it's never you have one presentation in history that you spend all semester getting together. You have a presentation in math, presentation in French, and Spanish, and gym. You're like, why is there a gym presentation? And you're giving a bunch of these presentations. And people forget this way because we get older, right? We're 13 years old. We're not 50 or something. So it's a lot of stress for a kid to handle. And the third problem, which is the most important one, is every single presentation, Ryan, whether it's at school and later in work, is tied to a punishment. So it's never, hey, Ryan, what are you passionate about? Do you like plants? Do you like podcasting? Do you want to give a presentation where we're all going to clap and celebrate you? No, that's not how it works. Especially if you don't do a good job. You lose 30% of your grade. So if 100% of all of our presentations are mandatory, if they're all different, and if they're all tied to a punishment, we'll probably see it as a chore. So yeah, that's where I think it comes from.
Man, I've never thought about this. The way you just described that makes so much sense. And I don't know why. You're right. I've never heard it described that way. I've always just heard people are afraid of speaking, but it's so true. If anyone is talking at any, TED Talks. Okay. If you're getting on the stage for a TED Talk, you are an absolute expert in that field. You're not only an expert, you're passionate. And you volunteered to do the talk, right? So and then you've also probably practiced that talk over and over and over and given it 1,000,000 times. It makes so much sense that you wouldn't love speaking if you were put on the spot, uncomfortable, had no idea what you're talking about, and had a ton of pressure of the situation on it. I don't know. I mean, it's crazy to think about. So how do we get over that, right? Should we be teaching people differently in school, or, where does it start?
Yeah, absolutely. No, sorry, I just didn't want to interrupt you. That's why I was just listening to the full. Yeah, absolutely, man. I completely agree with the TED Talk piece. Is a lot of that is tied to the expertise, and especially people who are sitting in the room, they feel intimidated because they're like, that can't be me. Like, come on. Yeah. And I'm the best example of this, by the way. I started MasterTalk in my mother's basement when I was 22 years old, and I had a bachelor's degree in accounting. And my whole life I was presenting in a language I didn't even know. I grew up in French school in Montreal, where I'm based. And I was presenting in first, second, third grade in a language I didn't know. So trust me, totally empathetic to that. In terms of the other piece around schooling and what we could do differently, I spend 10% of my time coaching kids. Not really for money. That's more just to understand for me intellectually, where does the fear of communication begin? And why does it begin in that moment? And I think what I realized of coaching a lot of these kiddos, some of them are like 5, some of them are 17, they're all in this one group, is I realized that the kids who are like under 9 or 10 years old that don't know what a presentation is, they just present like nothing's wrong. Like there's no fear. But usually when the kids are older, like 10, 11, 12, 13, the fear is already in their body in some way because they've had a bad experience in the education system. So how do we fix this? Let me give a couple of strategies here. I want to open source this and create some sort of version eventually, but I'll kind of give you the easy stuff that people can implement from a podcast media. I would say the first thing is to focus on one presentation and let the kid pick the topic, not you. So instead of forcing them to talk about Shakespeare or the Renaissance, like they're like, what am I shaking here? What's a milkshake? What's going on? Right? Instead, it's, what do you care about, Robbie? What do you care about, Julia? What do you care about, Joe? And then they might say something like a video game. So instead of going, video games suck and you suck, you go up to the kid instead and you say, hey, like, I love video games. What's your favorite one? And you make a presentation on that. That's the first advice that I would share. That's the first piece. The second piece is, I really want to emphasize the first one, the sense of let's say they spend 3 months working on communication, Ryan. They should only be presenting that one presentation. So they're not stressed about changing the content or creating new presentations. Too much stress for the kid. So they don't see momentum. The second advice that I have is to implement what I call puzzle. And this doesn't just work with kids, this works with adults, it works for all of us. And puzzle means, it's kind of like jigsaw puzzles, those toys used to play as kids. So I'll throw back the question back to you, Ryan, because I have a feeling you know the answer to it for some reason. Let's say you're working on a puzzle. It's an easy question. Which pieces do you start with first and why?
Corners. They're defined.
Exactly, right? The corners are defined, absolutely. And the other piece I would add to that is they're easier to find in the box and they're easier to put together. But we don't do that in communication. We do the opposite. We start the middle first. We shove a bunch of stuff in our presentations. We get to the presentation. We ramble throughout the whole thing. And then the last slide sounds something like this. Yeah, so thanks. Not the right approach. So instead... And how this came about, since you asked the last question, is because I had trouble coaching a 5-year-old on how to speak because she didn't know what a presentation was, and I was panicking. It was like my first ever kids group or something, and she was like, what's a presentation? What's an introduction? What's a conclusion? And I was like, Jesus, how am I supposed to coach this person? So I looked around in my basement, and I saw puzzles, and I was like, communication's like a jigsaw puzzle. And she was like, oh, I like puzzles, and I had to make something up. So anyways... So the goal is, whenever we practice a presentation, start with the edges first. Practice just the introduction 50 times until it's perfect. 50 seems like a big number, Ryan, but it actually isn't, because it doesn't take a long time to actually get it right. Because the presentation is like a minute. Same thing with the conclusion. What's a great movie with a terrible ending? Terrible movie, right? So same thing, 50 times for the close, and then go for the middle. So what we have the kiddos do, and people can just copy paste this with their kids or other educators, is you have the kids just do the introduction 50 times, and you have them stress out about nothing else. So there's no like speech writing, the whole thing is just the intro. And then they get really good at the intro and you celebrate. Last tip I'll give, and I'll throw it back to you because I've been monologuing for a bit here, is around how to give feedback. And this is very nuanced here. So the way that I give feedback is I actually don't. I let the kids give feedback to each other. And this is interesting in the sense that when you start doing that, especially with kids who are young, it's hard for them to develop that ownership for a project that they take on. until they're like 16 or 18-ish. So instead what you want to do is when you have the kids give feedback to each other, even if the feedback is bad, they start gaining an ownership to each other. They start becoming friends with each other, and they start taking the presentation more seriously. That's how you get them results.
That's interesting. So it's just building that engagement. It's do you care at all if it's, I mean, you said you don't care if it's positive or negative, or even constructive, I would imagine, if you're allowing kids to give feedback. But although any feedback at that point would probably be constructive, right?
You got it. So the approach I take, no one asked me these follow-up questions. I love it, man. So the way that I see it is it depends on their approach. So no one's allowed to give aggressive feedback on the call. So it's more around they give a feedback point, and if I feel it's too out of line, like it doesn't make sense, I might chime in a little bit. And I'm always there to kind of navigate the conversation. But by the way, I don't think you even need to be a coach to do this. Like, it's not therapy, right? It's not like it's not like being a neurosurgeon. I honestly think anyone could do this. Like, that's what my vision for the world is. Like, if every public school teacher was just trained a little bit on how to do this, it's not hard. I mean, if I could do it, anyone could do this. It'll be easy for them to just facilitate. It's just understanding those nuances. So going back to the group around the feedback, you give them feedback on the feedback sometimes, but you specifically focus a lot more on celebrating good feedback versus punishing bad feedback. So for example, if a 7-year-old kid goes, you need to like smile more, I'll say something like, Julia, that was such a great feedback. I completely agreed. And then I'll go back to Robert and I would say something like, oh, let's say Robert's like a 9-year-old kid. I would say, Robert, you're doing such a great job. And if you just smile a little bit more, you'll be even better. Something like that. So you kind of just reinforce the feedback, and then they get a lot more comfortable, and then they don't need you anymore, and they just start coaching each other.
This is beautiful. This is Management 101. I love, so there's a handful of reasons that I wanted to have you on the podcast. And the first reason is that I think it's really important for everyone to have an understanding of how to articulate their ideas. I think it's clear in business. A lot of people that listen to this are thought leaders, are business leaders, are trying to advance their career. I think if you can articulate your thoughts in a concise way, then you're going to be much better off. Secondly, I think there's a lot of metaphors that could be taken from different experiences, and speaking may be a metaphor for a lot of things, such as sales, such as management, such as education. And what you're saying, it makes so much sense, because by engaging the other peers, right? Like let's talk about like a sales team. What if you're managing a sales team and you're going through mock sales calls? Well, if you can engage colleagues and peers in the feedback loop of these mock sales calls, you're going to get feedback that's different than what a manager might be able to bring to the table. B, by allowing a peer to give feedback, you're actually encouraging them to think critically about the process itself. So in your situation, when you're allowing a 9-year-old to give feedback on a speech, they're thinking critically about what needs to be in a speech. I love this. I think this is genius in the way you manage or instruct anybody.
You articulate that way better than me. I'll have to copy paste that. But yeah, you're absolutely right. I love the way you put it, in the sense of when the 9-year-old is giving feedback, they're also thinking of, wait a second, when I'm coaching this person, I got to implement it too. So I love that. It's really well said.
Yeah. So articulating your ideas, right? So we've already said, the practice the edges, right? So the beginning and the end. I mean, what's the mumbo jumbo in the middle, right? Because when I'm thinking about a puzzle, all I'm trying to do is like, and I'm colorblind too, which makes it so freaking hard. But it's like, okay, well, I don't know. Every shape is like a little like nipple looking shape, right? And they all fit into each other if you smash them in hard enough. And then all the colors run into each other, right? So you've got the beginning, you've got the end. How do we create a meaningful, like content focused middle, or like the beef, right? It's a sandwich. It's not the bread. It's like that meat in the middle. Like, how do we make that meaningful?
Absolutely, brother. Happy to jump into that. I love the way you phrased the question. It's hilarious. So the way that I think about this is, let's start with the edges and then let's jump into the middle. So don't worry, I have an answer for that too. So what's nice about the edges is I really want to make sure everyone who's listening right now that you're really implementing the first part. And I'll tell you why it's so vital. Even if you're going to take a lot of great notes on the middle when I go through that content framework, the importance of the edges is so key, everyone. And the reason is because if you implement 50 times the intro, your energy shifts in communication. Right? Here's what I mean specifically, if someone hasn't done it yet. Let's say you're someone who's not been that great of a communicator your whole life, and you look at your next presentation that you're passionate about. You pick something cool. Like, let's say I was coaching, I would say, make a presentation on your podcast. So that way you can speak at like podcasting conferences, so that whenever maybe you're talking about a different topic, like how to get more downloads or something. But at the beginning, you'll always start with my mission, a personal story. So if you knock that out of the park, you'll get way more exposure in person. And that's a repeatable presentation because you keep doing it over and over again. Right. So let's see, we use that as an example. You're a great speaker, but let's say you weren't in the context of this conversation. Let's say you did your intro. The first time you might go, oh man, I got like 10 presentations to think about. This is really stressful. And you write it once, but then you present it like 10, 15 times. You go, oh, my 15th one was actually way better than my first one. So now you have that new boost, and then you're like, and then I call it the mindset barrier just breaks. Right, the mindset barrier just breaks, and then you just go, oh yeah, I could totally do the conclusion and the content too. So what's actually cool about this strategy is you don't even worry about the content framework anymore because your beliefs around communication change. So that's the most important thing, everyone. So if you're listening to this, don't just write down the edges. Oh, I got to do the edge. Like, actually do it in that order and then listen to the middle. So with that said, let's jump into the middle. So with the middle, what I would say to keep things super simple is, what is your key idea? And here's the frame I like to use for the key idea. Let's say we're giving a presentation on our life's legacy. Let's use that frame because it's more fun to give a analogy on that. So let's say it's the last presentation of your life. Okay, last presentation of your life. And after you present, you die. Okay, so you can present for as long as you want. You can present for 20 minutes. Yeah, I know it's morbid, but hear me out. 5 hours, 20 hours, you pick the time. But there's one problem. Okay, you could have as many people in the room. There could be like 10 million people in the room. But the problem is, regardless of how long you get to speak, your audience forgets everything except for one sentence. Okay? Except for one sentence. What do you want the sentence to be? And that is how you really focus in on that one sentence. And for me, I'm sure that your follow-up question is probably what mine is. Mine is how would the world change if you were an exceptional communicator? That's my one sentence. If I could only say one thing, that's the one thing. So for your presentation coming out, obviously for those of you in the corporate world, that's a bit crazy. It's like, well, Brenden, I'm a sales guy at a company. But the reason I like that analogy, Ryan, is because it forces us to focus in. So the more, I guess, less scary version of that framework is if you could only share one sentence and they could only hear and listen to and implement one sentence from an entire presentation, what do you want that sentence to be? And the caveat here is we won't be able to figure that out right away. Like the sentence I just gave you, that took me years of crafting and giving a bunch of stuff. So I'd encourage people, if you're doing this tactically, write 10, 15 key ideas, like on a piece of paper, look at all of them and go, which one, if I convince my audience of, fixes everything else. So if I get that one thing, it fixes everything else. Okay, as an example. That's the one piece. The next piece is, now think of yourself like a lawyer. So here's kind of the visualization I'd like to give. So let's say you're in court and you give your one key idea. Okay, if you just ask yourself the question, how would the world change if you're an exceptional communicator? You'll start to dream more about your communication skills. Or something, let me give you another one, easier one. I believe every human being on earth can be an exceptional communicator. Okay, let's throw that in. So then the lawyers are looking at you and they're like, okay, prove it. Like, I don't believe you. I don't think that's true. That's kind of the frame you want to have. Like the worst audience member. So now you have 3 boxes. And I like Kate saying 3 because it's easy. So just 3 boxes. And each of them is an argument as to why your key idea is right. But the argument isn't necessarily a debate. It is a tool that you can use in your toolbox to defend. I'll give you an example to make this super practical. This is what happens when you ask for the middle, right? It's a lot of information. So, key idea. Somebody says, okay, Brenden, how is every human being going to be a great communicator? It doesn't make any sense. So what's the first box that I use to defend that key idea in my keynotes? It's always my personal story. It always works. Okay, I grew up in a city called Montreal. struggled my whole life with English as a first language. And I also wore a cast for most of my life because I have a crooked left arm. So it was really hard for me to make friends. And I started a YouTube channel on public speaking tips without a PhD, with a bachelor's in communication. I started coaching CEOs who were double my age, who had worked longer at the company than I was alive. I had a lot of insecurities. I'm literally coming to life from my mom's basement. I started my YouTube channel on a couch. So why do I tell all this? Because it helps me defend my kid. Well, if I could do it, what's your excuse? Right? So that's box number 1. And then box number 2 and 3, without going too much in detail here, is you try different analogies, stories, quotes, and you see what resonates. And whatever resonates the most is what you prioritize in the middle of your presentation. But the final point I'll end is that the best communicators on the planet, Ryan, that's why they only present one topic, like Gary Vee or Tony Robbins, because they try a bunch of tools on a single topic until they find the ones that click with the audience, where people are crying, where people are taking action. And that's how you actually optimize a speech.
Jeez, there's so much to unpack there.
I know, sorry.
You're right. Like, hey, how's the middle work? It's like, oh, you mean like 80% of what I talk about? Yeah, it's crazy. So the one thing that sticks out to me, and the one thing that resonates based on my experience as a executive manager for a sales company, is not enough people practice their sales pitches. And what happens in that situation, there's a bunch of different types of sales, right? But if you have 15,000 products, you can't practice a sales pitch for every single product. Now, if you have one product, if you work for, let's say you work for, I don't know, Google, and you're selling cloud storage, right? Like that sales pitch is going to sound very similar because you're constantly doing it. Or if you're doing sales calls over the phone at a center where it's just a robocall center, like you're going to get really good at every single aspect of that call because you're going to understand the nuance of the way you say things, how you say things, where you put emphasis on different syllables. And I think that's a lot of what you're talking about is this practice. It's the repetition that goes into it that allows you to become an expert. And the other thing that I had wrote down, which I think is the strategy of becoming great at speaking, is start building some of these wins, right? Because you have to practice winning. You have to practice 50 times at least to get the start of your speech right. And what that does is it gives you like that confidence and that win and allows you to understand that, yes, I can do this. I've proven it to myself. And now it's building win on win on win on win on win for success down the road.
100%. I love the way that you summarized that. A couple of thoughts came to mind there. The first one, going back to the win specifically for sales, since we're talking about the one tip I got from Alex Hormozy that I think is brilliant, is record your sales calls and keep the best ones. So that when you start having a losing streak, which happens a lot for all of us, I'm sure, you go back to the winners and you saw what you did right on those calls, and that's how you reignite that energy. That's one piece. The other piece that you talked about, which is so key, is around the idea of 15,000 products, right? If you're selling cloud storage for a specific company like Google, yeah, you know what you're talking about, because at the end of the day, the benefits of cloud is the same for every single person you're talking to. Even maybe the industry changes and all that stuff, but it's the same thing. So it all goes back to focus. You know, we always say that pressure makes diamonds, but I think the way I would change it is putting the right narrow focus onto one thing that creates that momentum is what allows you to win. And I think the challenge is most of us don't focus in on that one thing. And then the last piece that you talked about around the sales pitches, the only thing I would add to that is the reason why most of us don't practice sales pitches is because we don't practice in the right way. So let's say there's like 20 minutes of like pitch, whatever. It could be like a 10-minute, to your point, sometimes it's a call, sometimes it's a formal orals presentation. Let's assume it's an orals. Well, the issue is, let's say you got 20 minutes, you present it 3 times, you spend an hour doing this, and then you go, oh my God, I'm so tired. You want to get lunch? And then you kind of compare your third recording to the first one. You don't really see that much of a difference because you're too lazy to listen to the whole thing. And by the way, I'm saying that because I made every mistake. If I'm coaching on this or talking about it, it's because I made every mistake in the book. Versus, that's why I'm a big fan of puzzle. So for those of you who kind of zoned out with the middle, the middle part, I know that's meaty. So instead, what I would say is like, go back to that sales pitch. Don't even worry about the content. What's your first 2 minutes sound like? So take 30 minutes and practice the first 2 minutes of your sales pitch 15 times. That's really where you're going to get the ROI from listening to this episode. Because after your 15th time, you'll actually be pretty fresh because it's only been 30 minutes you've been practicing. And you'll go, oh man, like the 15th one was way better than the first one. And that's the momentum that creates motivation to keep going.
Man, what would you say, not to take it in a completely different direction, but this popped into my mind. Like, what would you say a 9-year-old does better than the CEO of a Fortune 500 company when it comes to giving speeches? Or just communicate.
Really good.
It doesn't even have to be like a speech.
No. I like the question. Don't worry. I'm not like fizzling. I love this question. It's so good. That's why I want to do it justice. What does the 9-year-old do differently? Okay. Let me riff on a couple of things. Excellent question. So the first one is that let's say the executive is a lot more closed-minded. A lot more closed-minded. So whether they're a man or a woman, it's actually the same on both aisles. Actually, no, I think it's mostly men who are more closed-minded, if I'm being honest. But look at the numbers. But as the point I want to drive is they're a lot more closed-minded in general. So they're not open to a lot of the wacky ideas that I share, like the random word exercise where you pick a random word and you give presentations out of thin air. They're not really open to those types of things. So I kind of I have to manhandle them into doing these things. Right. And I have to paint the burning bridge. Look, do you want to get your promotion? Yes. How long have you been struggling? 5 years. You want to struggle another 5? Right. So I have to actually put a lot more pressure onto them to get them to move, announce, versus not always the time, but I'm generalizing, but you get what I mean. 9-year-old, that's never a problem. 9-year-old, they just go, oh my God, you're a YouTuber? Yeah, I'll just listen to whatever literally, I wish I was lying, but it's just the truth. So they're just a lot more open-minded, and they're a lot more malleable and adaptable to those new ideas. And they have a fresh outlook on things. That's the first piece. The second piece, I would say, is they're a lot more what's another specific? Because I was thinking about, I would say that's the biggest difference is really around the open-mindedness. The second piece, they get results way quicker than executives, way faster.
Why?
And the reason is because of prioritization. So the executive will go, and the CEO too, like everyone's in the same bucket here. Mm-hmm. They're like, oh yeah, well I got this boardroom meeting, I got all these priorities, blah, 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 blah. So I have to really set that burning bridge to go like, hey, like you're on a burning ship right now. And so I have to really paint. I never wanted to do that, honestly, early in my career. I just wanted to guys, like communication is important. I thought everyone knew this. And people just don't. To your point, like they're doing really well in sales, and they just think, I think I'm just going to coast here, and even if I want to make double the money or double the impact. But the 9-year-old, they don't have actually much going on because they're 9, right? So they actually spend a lot more time prioritizing the stuff that we're sharing. Third one, I would say, you actually got me really thinking of this idea. I actually have to reflect on this on the side too. The third point, is energy. A lot of my executives are beaten down. Okay, that's said with love. Right? And I'm happy with everyone I got, but they're a bit beaten down. They need a little bit of Brenden kind of energy, kind of shock in their system to be like, I need to get excited about learning again. Because I'm so used to all of these boring kind of boardroom presentations and these draughty things. Whereas the kiddo doesn't need it. I actually get more energized from them than the other way around. Because they come on, they're like, we get to talk to Brenden, it's fun. So I hope that does justice to your question. But yeah, those are the differences I see.
Yeah, it's crazy. Well, it's in a way, you almost wonder so when you're saying, I go back to what you started with was, let's not mandate these speeches. Let's talk about something that's meaningful to these kids. And if you're saying, hey, Brenden, little 7-year-old Brenden, what do you love? And he says, I love video games. You say, okay, well, let's talk about video games. Let's do a speech about video games. Executives are invested in their companies. Maybe they don't just love it, you know? I mean, maybe they're experts in it, but there's like a certain amount of passion that comes with something you love, right? So, I mean, are you taking a CEO when you're training them to speak? Are you taking them and saying like, hey, are you doing the same thing as a 9-year-old? What do you love? What are you passionate about? Or is it, hey, this is really important. Like, you're the CEO of, you know, a major company. Let's talk about that because that's what your speech is about. I mean, you wonder about that, right?
Absolutely. Great point. So a couple of things, man. I would say I always thought at the beginning of my career that it was really around getting them to present something related to their companies. And what I ultimately came to the conclusion to is it doesn't work. And it's not as effective. I think that's the right term. And the reason is because, especially those who are maybe not CEOs always, but let's say executives of companies, they might not always be super, super duper passionate about the company or the thing that they're doing, always. Or they might be like an 8 out of 10 instead of an 11 out of 10, which actually is a big difference in the context of the work that I do. So instead, what I have them do is exactly what the 9-year-olds are doing. I just don't tell them that directly. So I'll give you an example. Like the first couple of weeks, I'll have them do the random word exercise, right? And people can just do this. Like, don't just listen to this. Do it too, right? So they do like, okay, pick a random word like Post-its, or paper, or like headphones or something. But I get a lot more pushback from that group. I think that's the difference. So they would say something like, oh, I don't want to do this, blah, blah, blah. And I go, okay, like, do you want to just stay where you are? And that's one piece. The other piece is the social pressure of the group. So let's say there's like two, whatever, executive CEO, put any title there. If at least 2 of them just implemented that week, it creates a lot of jealousy with everyone else in the group to go like, oh, well, everyone else, they're executives like me and they're making time for this and they're better than me, so I need to push up. So basically, long story short, to answer your question, I actually don't have them present anything to do with their companies unless they're the founder. If they're the founder of the company, I'll have them do that, like a tech CEO kind of deal. But if they're not, I'll have them do random presentations that have nothing to do with their companies and have them just build up the skill. Let's say the random word exercise, what I always tell them, and I'm happy to tell it here, is if you can make sense out of nonsense, you can make sense out of anything. And that's what I tell them. So it builds up their confidence, that thing like 100 times, and then we start talking about boardroom stuff like later on.
Yeah, it's funny that you say that too, because I often find that I think when someone brings like their authentic self to a conversation or to a presentation, man, it just hits home. You know, like it's relatable. And no one wants to get up and no one wants to get up and just hear someone like dredge on about their company or just go on about a sales pitch. Like, yeah, I get that you have a service that I need. Okay. You know, but how many times do I have to listen to this? Right? Like, I think when you can be relatable, that makes so much more sense. It's why I always try to have like a metaphor for something. It's just something stupid that I do. But I always say like, oh, well, you know, this is a lot like this. Because by bringing in other aspects of life, you start to create this curiosity within the person that you're talking to where there might be, you know, a similar interest, right? Like it's almost like networking in a way through a conversation of just being curious, being creative, and relating something to something that has nothing to do with either the product or the speech or the company. I mean, what do you think about that?
I completely agree. I think a lot of communication, as you know very well, is contextual, right, based on the situation we're in. So some rooms, let's say I'm talking to like very corporate, I usually don't take on those people anymore, but like super, super corporate, where I have to be in a suit and I have to be really professional. And there's other times, like the other end, where I'm at like an informal networking event with like other kind of people who are way more successful than I am. And I would say things like, but it's casual. So I'd say something like, when they go through fun facts, you know, I can karaoke in 8 different languages. I'm in the 0.5 top percentile of Spotify listeners for Justin Bieber, and I dance on my mother's basement an hour a day. So it's all about, which are all true, by the way. But the thing is, it's all about understanding what type of situation, what's the feel of the room, what's the mind of the room right now, and how can we gravitate. But I would say as a generalization, one thing that's lacking in general from most corporate people, or just entrepreneurs in general, is just a lack of personalization. There's not enough personal stories. And I feel a lot of us, we get personal stories wrong. We think that personal story equals traumatic experience from the childhood and curing our inner child and all this crazy stuff. Like, I mean, that's good. Go see a therapist, but that's not the point of personal stories. You could say something really easy, really like simple. Like the story I always tell in keynotes is called the blueberry story, which essentially is a story about how I'm a workaholic, which I am. I'm working all the time in my basement. So how do I have such a great relationship with my mom and my sister? Well, every time I pick up blueberries from the fridge, I always ask them if they want some first, and then I have blueberries. Super simple story, but people are relatable to me because they see what my values are, that I care about my parents to a certain extent, enough to give them blueberries, and there's a certain edge of who I am that's being shared. That, in general, to your point, is really missing. So the practical, tactical advice here is, what is the one moment of your life that's easy to tell, that's funny, that's an easy slice of life that you can incorporate into your everyday communications with your team, and you'll see that you'll go very far with that.
Yeah, one of the things that I've always done, I'm interested just from your expert opinion on this. I have this conversation with so many people, and it's almost like embarrassing to talk about. But I've always thought that if you take a hard stand on something that has absolutely no impact on anybody, like negative or positive, it's A, kind of funny, and then B, also gives like a little bit of insight into the way you think and something that might be important to you, but really is like doesn't matter. So one of the things I always do is I will talk about, I don't know, like nutrition for an example. And then I'll say something like, but I'm not always like super into health. Sometimes I eat gummy bears. And I just kind of like throw it out there. And someone will be like, gummy bears, really? And then I'll be like, oh yeah, you like gummy bears? What kind of gummy bears do you like? And immediately that'll turn into, sometimes, people actually know different brands of gummy bears. Sometimes they don't, but I will immediately turn that into, and just so you know, if you like Black Forest gummy bears and you're not a Haribo Gold Bear guy, I have no need for you in my life, and I don't think you should have an opinion on anything. It's like this weird hard stand about something that means absolutely nothing to anybody, but it tells people like, hey, I like gummy bears, so much so that I have like a brand of gummy bears that I'm like super into, and then it's funny that I'm like, and then your opinion doesn't matter whatsoever if you don't like that brand of gummy bear. So, I mean, in your expert opinion, am I messing everything up, or what's going on there, man?
I mean, you're clearly very talented, Red. I'm sure what you're doing is working for you just fine. You probably have like a gummy bear empire that I'm not aware of, like some multi-gajillion.
I do not. I should monetize it somehow, but no, I don't.
No, it's funny because you were saying that. My mind was just going to, are there any people who became billionaires just selling gummy bears? And that's where my mind is going. I'm like,
Mr. Haribo. I don't even know if that's a thing, but yeah, Haribo. Dude, they have to. Someone has to. Gummy bears are delicious. Everyone buys them. People love them.
Yeah, then I was about to Google and I was like, oh wait, I'm in an interview. I shouldn't do that. But anyways, but the point is, you're absolutely right. I think the idea here is it's tactic versus religion, right? So, and by religion, I don't mean like Christianity or something. I mean like principle. So these are great tactics. I think these are the great things. I think the principle is figuring out what is the outcome, and I'll give a super easy example to demonstrate that. And how can you reverse engineer that outcome in a way that works with your style and who you are as a communicator? So let's say the principle is, let's say there's an outcome of, I want to meet cool people. That's super simple. You go to an event, whatever the event is. It could be like a house party. It could be a cocktail. It could be a housewarming thing. And your goal is to meet great people. A lot of great people are coming there. So how do you reverse engineer it? You could do the gummy bears, right? If that's authentic to you, I think that works well. My version of your gummy bear analogy is more in the sense of, I just ask really deep questions about life. So I hate surface level conversations. Like, it just doesn't work for me. Like, people ask me about the weather. I was like, just look outside. Like, why are you asking me about the weather? It just doesn't make sense. Like, I just never understood that question. Yeah. Versus like, what's one regret that you have in life? Like, if you were God and you could do anything, what would you do first? Like, these are the kind of weird stuff that I like to ask people questions on. Or just simply, if I just met them, what are you excited about right now? Like, what are you passionate about? And I like people who share energy. So if people are like feeling, I just can't talk to them. I can't sustain a conversation with them for a long period of time.
Especially to that question. Yeah. I'm excited about, I don't know, gummy bears. It's like, yeah, you sound really excited.
Exactly, man. So I think the point is reverse engineer who you are. So just ask yourself instead, let's say in the context of relationship building, because I think it's easier to copy paste, is who is the person that you love talking to the most? And what types of questions would you love answering? Or that you would love to hear, and just bring that more out externally. Kind of like how in sales, where you don't need a guess, just go ask your favorite clients why they bought your thing and just go find more people like them. Like, it's kind of the same thing, except most of us, we undervalue our winners. We kind of we take our winners for granted, so to speak. I think that's another way of putting it.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting thought. I actually love the idea of deep conversation, like, especially even when you're first meeting someone. I did have a friend who would always do this, and he actually helped me get into sales. But he would always just like throw out random controversial questions and be like, what do you think about this? And you're like, geez, man, this is like a dinner conversation. It's like that whole idea of like, well, we don't talk about politics, religion, or there's like politics, religion at the dinner table, or at a dinner party. And you're like, that's fine. Like, okay, it's not going to get uncomfortable, but you're also not going to really understand someone, And I think it's important to say, whether you're giving a speech, whether you're trying to build a deeper relationship, I think it's important to understand where people stand. And I think it's also important to be able to have these conversations, to articulate, to speak freely about the way you believe without offending people, right? Or without being offended when someone disagrees with you. And I think it's a skill. And I think it's important that you're doing this, even just teaching people how to speak or give speeches, because it lacks in our community. It lacks in society. There's so much argument. And I think if people communicated better, they may be more receptive, if things were presented in a different way.
Oh, yeah, I completely agree with you, Ryan. Communication, to your point, is so much more than just presentations you give at work, or getting the next sale, or getting the next raise. It's every micro interaction of our lives. Right? It's every interaction we're going to have with every single human being we get to meet. It's the way that we order ice cream at an ice cream parlor. It's the way that we order food at a restaurant. It's the way that we talk to strangers at a park, or strangers when we travel, right, to new places. It's the way that we interact with our families, right? I always like to say me and my sister haven't argued in over 10 years because, well, we're great communicators. So we're able to communicate effectively. And it really goes back to this question, right, that we talked a little bit earlier. How would your life change if you're an exceptional communicator? Don't just write that question down. Really reflect on it. Like, people who do this right, Ryan, are going to take 10, 15 minutes and just really reflect on that question. Because we dream about our vacations. We dream about the expensive things we want to buy. But none of us dream about our communication skills. And that's really the first step, is building that burning desire. Because for all of us, that reason is different. Once again, exactly to your point. For some people, it's, hey, I need to get that next sale, which is totally fine. I'm totally with you. I'm in that camp too. And there's other people, it's, hey, I want a better relationship with my sister. I haven't talked to her in 7 years. And for somebody else, it's like, it's really hard. I have a lot of trouble making friends. So for all of us, that reason is different. But once you find what that one thing is for you, and you really journal that out, you'll build that burning motivation to actually do it. In the same that with health, if you start to vision yourself in better health, in better shape, you can carry your kids, all that stuff, you get really emotional about those things, then you can actually push yourself to get those results.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring up like the conversation you can have with family and friends, and I'm curious because I've had situations where I don't know if I've just miscommunicated and there may be issues with family members or friends where we don't have the strongest relationship because of the way we communicate. So how can someone who, even if they're good at communicating for business, giving speeches, selling, whatever it may be, how can you apply some of these principles to like interpersonal relationships so that you can be honest, you can be authentic, you can say what's really important and needs to be said, but you can do it in a way that maybe doesn't offend people, or maybe you can kind of I think you used the word disarm, or someone has just disarming someone so that you can be honest and authentic in the way you say things.
Absolutely, brother. So a couple of thoughts there. I would say the first piece is it goes back to listening, but I'm going to be a lot more specific than most people, right? So I'm not just going to say listening. So what I always like to say is the more we listen to the world, the more the world listens back to us. Right? So if we want people to hear us, if we want people to listen to our perspective, we must first take the leadership role and start listening more to the world. And I'll explain exactly what that means. So what does that mean tactically? I always like to call this questions versus statements. So in everyday human conversation, a percentage of what we say is always statements. I believe X. I want this. Let's do this. Versus, why do you believe this? Why do you think we should do this? What is most important to you and why? So we start to ask questions. But what I would encourage people to think about, Ryan, is what's the ratio? And for most people, it's 90-10. 90% or more, by the way. 90 at the low end, or people who are decent. 90% of what people say usually is a statement, and 10% is usually a question. So let's say me and you are having a discussion. Usually how it would go in like, normally is, okay, what do you believe? I believe this. What do you believe? And it's kind of like a ping-ponging of statements. Whereas what really strong communicators do is they change the ratio between the statements and the questions from 90-10 to 80-20, or even 70-30. Or in some cases, 60-40. So what does that mean? That means 60% of what they say or 70% of what they say might be a statement and 30% might be a question. So let's say, for example, I'll use a personal example. Like me and my mother didn't get along a lot growing up as a kid. Not because my mother was a bad person or anything, but because she immigrated from Sri Lanka at a really young age, right? So when she came from Sri Lanka to Canada, she was like, fairly young, right? She was 30, but it was the first time ever taking a flight. She didn't know what the winter was. So she had a lot of her tradition, and then she had me. So a lot of me and her would clash a lot because I would grow up in modern values in Canada, which is more individualistic, and she grew up more in a collectivistic developing country. So the values would always clash. So every time we used to communicate, it used to be statement. Well, why can't I sleep over at my friend's house? That makes no sense, Mom. And then my mom goes, well, you can't do that. We don't trust other ethnicities. All this. I won't get into specifics, but you get the idea. But once again, not my mom's fault. It's just the way that she was raised, because there was a big war where she was raised in a civil war in Sri Lanka. So she grew up with a lot of fear. But how do I know this? Because as I got older and as I matured over time, Brian, I started to replace my statements with questions. So I would say, okay, Mom. Well, I wouldn't call her Mom. I would call her Amma. But anyways, I'd say, okay, Mom, why do you think, why is this a problem for you? Why is it? And I would just listen. And she would tell me about all of the kind of craziness that used to happen in her country. And I was like, this makes perfect sense. So then I would go back to her and I would say something like, hey, we don't live in that country anymore. You don't have to worry about this stuff. So gradually over time, now me and my mom get along just fine. We never argue. And that's the point. But as the person listening to this episode, I'm talking to the audience now, since you have the information now, it is up to you. Bad news. It's up to you now to take on that leadership role with your family. Don't expect other people to do that for you.
Man, that's powerful. That's powerful. I think this is really important for people to hear. Brenden, I don't want to take up too much more of your time. I love this conversation. I could talk to you forever about this.
Wow, this flew by. Oh
I know, right? Well, I have three final questions that I ask at the end of every single podcast episode, and I want to get to those.
Let's do it.
But you have obviously put a lot of time and energy into understanding human interaction, into communication, into speeches. So if anyone has a need to become a better speaker, or maybe they just think, look, this is something that I think is going to be important for my kids or my family or for myself, just to have a better understanding of, how can people get a hold of you and learn to articulate their ideas in a way that's meaningful to the world?
Absolutely. First of all, it's such an honor to be on your show. You're such a great interview, man. It's such a fun time. So yeah, 2 easy ways to keep in touch. One is definitely MasterTalk, right? Check out the YouTube channel in one word, type it up. You'll have access to hundreds of free videos. And then the second way is for those who are interested in coaching, you can come to one of my free trainings over Zoom that we do every few weeks, and that's rockstarcommunicator.com to register.
Awesome. Well, Brenden, final 3 questions of the podcast, so let's get right into it. Question 1. What is the most impactful book that you have ever read?
Thirst by Scott Harrison. Scott Harrison is the CEO of Charity Water. He started a nonprofit to help the world gain access to clean water. The reason it's always been my most impactful book is because of a quote in the book. And the quote that forever changed my life was, "The goal is not to live forever, but rather create something that will." And that really stuck with me because back then I was I was doing well financially. I was a technology consultant in corporate. And when I read that quote, I said, what am I doing with my time? What legacy am I leaving people? And honestly, I've been hiding from MasterTalk for a long time until I read that book. So I highly recommend people check it out.
Oh, that's awesome. If you could have a drink with anyone in the world, past or present, who would it be? What would you drink and why?
What would I drink? There's a lot of people I would love to talk to. I would say out of all of them, I'll pick the person that I think I'll have the hardest time having access to in my lifetime. Peter Thiel. I'd love to speak to him. He's the CEO of, he started PayPal and Palantir. He's the head of the PayPal Mafia, which we won't get into today. But yeah, very successful guy, author of the book 0 to 1. And I would drink probably water or some sort of juice. I'm not really alcoholic, alcoholic. I don't drink a lot. Sorry, that's the wrong term. But I was like, oh, that's gonna get me in trouble. And I would just ask him a lot. I would ask him for his list of questions that he asks other people. That would be an immense value add, and I think it would change my life.
I love that. I've never heard that as a question, to understand the questions that someone else asks. I think that's perfect. It's perfect. And the last question, the Every Breath Counts podcast, it's all about leveraging every breath you take to achieve greatness and success in your life. And it's also about having gratitude for every breath that you take. And I do that by having a podcast, talking to people like you, Brenden, and it brings me joy. And I think it's meaningful to help me achieve the success that I know is possible in my life. And I love it. So how do you make every breath count in your life?
Yeah. I took a breath there. That's kind of funny. But I would say for me, how I make every breath count is realizing who the enemy is. Because I feel a lot of people don't know who the enemy is. They think it's a person. Thinking it's the person who's cutting them off in traffic, or asking them the wrong question, or throwing them off the wrong way, or their significant other yelling at them over not throwing out the garbage or something. But the real enemy is the same for all of us. And the enemy is time. And it's ticking on all of us. So when we realize that time is the only thing that matters, for when we meet someone who's mad, we could be the last person they ever meet. They might die tomorrow. We don't know. So how are we going to treat every person that we're going to meet in our lives? And obviously it's weird for a 26-year-old kid to say that, but that's what really put my life into perspective, is how do we optimize time? How do we make sure that when the time is up, whether it's in 10 years, 20 years, 100 years, that we can say that we've lived a great life? And I take my time really seriously. I think that's what's created a difference for me.